Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow with me, your host. We are broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, and on TikTok. My name's Alistair McConnachie. I am the director of Scotland's premier pro-UK campaigning organisation called A Force for Good, AFFG. And we've got a packed show for you this Wednesday night. The big news politically in Scotland today was John Swinney's speech on immigration to, of all people, JP Morgan Chase in their head office here in Glasgow. Now, JP Morgan is, of course, one of the world's biggest financial capital firms, and quite what they wanted John Swinney to talk to them about, I will be elaborating upon in the show. Folks, please do send in your greetings. Please tell us where you are watching from. Please tell us what your thoughts are tonight. And please send in any comments or questions that you may have, and we'll do our best to read them out. Hello to the folks who are joining on TikTok. We're going to be speaking about John Swinney's obsession, his obsession with immigration, because, you know, in the year 2022 to 2023, Scotland got almost 83,000 new long-term immigrants, more people than the entire town of Paisley. But that's still not enough for full-on immigration John Swinney. That's what we're going to start calling him, full-on immigration John Swinney. A new town the size of Paisley into Scotland's not enough. It's not enough. We need more. He didn't put it in those words, but that is, of course, the implication of his speech today. Robert says, can I get a shout out for Anne Ramsey? She's a true unionist and loves Scotland. Well, Robert, all the best to Anne. We love our Scottish unionists. Absolutely. Anybody else want a shout out? Just put it in your TikTok there and we'll say hello to you. Hello to Derek tonight, who says, good evening, Alistair and fellow unionists around the world. I hope everyone is doing well. We're doing well, but I had to sit through on everybody's behalf an entire hour of John Swinney. Let me tell you, that took it out of me. That took it out of me today. It absolutely did. Good evening to Debbie. Good evening. Trump is in power, she says. Woohoo. Folks, tell us what you think of Trump. Who watched the inauguration and what did you think of it? Send in your comments on that as well, and we'll read those out. Derek comes in again. Good to see Trump back in office. Robert says, Anne loves your live broadcasts. Good to hear it. Good to hear it. A lot of people love our live broadcasts, including Oksana there, who says, hi all. And to Dominic, good to see Dominic around. Nice to see a real saltire that doesn't look like the washed out blue SNP saltires. That's true, isn't it? The SNP, attempting to do everything differently, just said, well, what color is the saltire? It's dark blue. Let's have a light blue saltire. I mean, I like the light blue saltires as well. The dark blue is more traditional. The theory is that it's much more weatherproof because it had, in the old days, it had darker dyes, darker blue dyes in it. And so it was more weatherproof. So they went with the dark blue. That's the story. So I'm told. But we love our flags of the home nations. Oksana says, Trump has already signed a lot of decrees, including leaving the WHO, that's the World Health Organization, and managing Ukraine and immigration. Yes, they're called executive orders. We don't have such things in the United Kingdom. But what that means is that the president basically has the power of, say, an ancient monarch who can just decree things and expect, or at least hope, that the rest of society will obey it because it becomes the law. And so executive orders are very powerful in that sense. However, the problem with executive orders is that they can be easily overturned by the next president who didn't like any of those executive orders. Whereas if you get something passed in Congress or Parliament, then there's more consistency there. There's more long-term sustainability, because by the time of the next president coming around, there'll still be a lot of members of that Congress or Senate who were elected last time around and who voted for it and who'll continue to vote for it. So getting something through democratically through the Parliament or through the American Senate and Congress is likely to be more sustainable in the long term. However, sometimes you just need a short-term fix, and that's where the executive orders, as they're called, come in. And it's a very powerful way of governing. Catherine says, "Hello, troops, make Britain great again." And to Anthony, nice to see you, sir. Now, let me tell you about my efforts on your behalf today. I sat through an entire hour of John Swinney addressing his sycophantic audience at JP Morgan Chase on the subject of growth. I sat through it so that you don't have to sit through it. And I'm here today to report to you what went down. Where to begin on all of that? Well, let me begin by giving you some background into it. Now, JP Morgan Chase is a big financial capital firm headquartered here in Glasgow. He must have chosen them for his speech because he wanted to appeal to them. The fact that they also allowed him to blether on for an hour suggests, at least it implies, that they were in agreement with the man, which isn't necessarily a good thing, quite frankly. Having a big, powerful American finance firm on your side might seem appealing, but at the same time, they may want simply to own you, or to own as much of Scotland that they don't already own. So, interesting choice of venue, put it that way. And his subject was encouraging growth in the Scottish economy. And it was held, as I say, in front of a couple of broadcast news agencies and a whole bunch of sycophants from civil society who must have been hand-picked to come along and agree with him. And thank you so much, Mr. First Minister, for that very interesting speech that I'm sure many of us agree with. You know, that kind of stuff. And you're like, what the? Oh, man. Oh, man. You know, nobody bothered to address the fundamentals of what he was talking about. So he's talking about growth. Nobody asked him, what do you mean, Mr. Swinney? What do you mean, Mr. Swinney? I'm here from Scotland for more money into my organisation. What do you mean when you say growth? Nobody bothered to ask him that. because, you know, growth as an economic measurement has lots of different measurements and they're measured different ways. And you can have gross domestic product, which is the commonly accepted means of growth. It's adding up all the goods and services that are produced in the country in 1 year and seeing how that differs percentage-wise from last year's figure. There's that. There is also growth as measured by gross domestic product per head of the population. Now, that's a more interesting and more meaningful measure, but an even better measure is income per head. Is your income rising year on year? And if it's not rising, if it's staying static, or in fact, it's getting less in relation to everything else, then that's very bad. Okay, so GDP can sometimes be rising, but your income per head is not. And it's that latter measurement that is the only sensible measurement for anybody who's interested in the matter. So he didn't mention what type of growth he's talking about. So what that says is he's essentially talking about GDP, gross domestic product, the least satisfying measure of growth and the least accurate as far as your personal income is concerned. So that's what we have to presume he was talking about, because not a single one of the journalists present bothered to ask him to clarify that. The most essential part of a speech about growth, you want to know, how are you defining growth before we begin here? So that tells you straight away, you know, what we're dealing with, the level of intellect in that room. So that was the first point. Now, just to clarify about growth, we did actually write an article about how mass immigration, what did we call it? We called it Economy Has Nothing to Show for Mass Immigration. That's on our website at aforceforgood.uk. And we'll put the link out in the threads here. Economy has nothing to show for mass immigration. And we explain what GDP is. We explain how the system measures growth, and we explain how that differs from the only growth that you and I care about, which is our income able to buy more this year than we could last year, or is it in fact buying less? And what we also show there in the article is that mass immigration has virtually no effect either on GDP or even on our personal income. And to the extent that it has an effect, it's either neutral or it's negative. So trying to grow the economy by wanting more people to come in is an absolute fool's errand. But don't expect John Swinney or all the British establishment political class, do not expect them to understand that, much less accept it. But the level of sycophancy really irritated me, right? There was even one person there, and I wrote this down, and you can see the video. We'll when this goes out again, we'll put the link to his speech, and you can actually hear one of the people actually said, quote, "You won't be surprised to know I've agreed with every single word you've said, John." I've agreed with every single word you've said, John. And John's like, well, thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that. As if just as well, basically, that you agreed with me, mate, just as well. And that's really what you're looking at there, is everybody's got something that they want to get, what they want to get from John Swinney there. It's not like, I wonder if immigration is actually a very good idea. It's probably not, but you know what? I'm just going to shut up, keep my mouth shut, you know. And another thing that I learned is that it's very easy to be First Minister. And it's very easy to be a corporate head of some NGO in Scotland, because basically all you need to do is just rehearse a lot of clever phrases and string them together in response either to a question or if you're trying to answer something. For example, let me give you an example. Imagine you ask me a question and like, I'm John Swinney, for example. Like, really, all I have to go is, well, ultimately, and I know you agree with me, Jack and John and Jill over there. I'm sure that we can all be in agreement, on, I think, at the forefront of what we're talking about on many vital matters, especially, related to ensuring you can continue to have a high-paying job in the public eye. I know you'll agree with me, therefore, when I say that it's all about creating an atmosphere of a common bond among stakeholders in civil society to come together on shared values of achieving collaboration among everyone in a way that reinforces and reunites us together towards a collective understanding that a valued activity is brought forward in a meaningful way. I know you agree with me on that. We were talking about that earlier, in which everyone can feel that they have ultimately contributed to a step change in the very important point of continuing to agree with me on these diverse matters, that you have my assurance continue and will continue to be at the center of what Scotland is about. And if you don't think that is correct, then Jack, Jill, John, you're probably not going to have a job tomorrow morning. And, that's really basically how it all came across to me. It's like, what an absolute circus of sycophants here. Anyway, getting down to what they actually were talking about. John assured us that his primary purpose in wanting economic growth, was in order to fight child poverty. Right, that's what's motivating, apparently, his desire for a successful economy, is to end child poverty. A worthy goal, no doubt, but he had to bring that in as the whole reason why he wants growth is to end child poverty. So he began with that. And then he just started laying off various claims, all of which could be challenged and should have been challenged. Where would we begin with that? Let me just check. Yeah. So growth was central to his thesis, but he didn't define the words. He then said that it was a serious issue in Scotland that we have a declining population, and that there had been fears that it was going to decline under 5 million, but that's not now the case thanks to mass immigration. Well, what is this obsession with having a growing population? What's wrong if the population did decline below 5 million? Now, I'm not saying that I'm not one of these people that wants a smaller population. I'm not one of these people who wants a bigger population. But I don't see the problem with a declining population as such. If it's properly economically managed, it just means there's more wealth to go around. And in fact, if you had a declining population and a successful economy, incomes per head would actually increase. So this obsession with not having a declining population is kind of absurd. Now, I know why they say it. They say it because it's like the only way that we're going to be able to either care for the elderly or pay the elderly's pensions is have lots of young people feeding in taxes into the system or providing the care. And that's one economic model, certainly. But don't tell me that we couldn't look after old people just because we had an imbalance. Of course we can. The economy, people will figure it out, and people will figure out how to care for the elderly and how to provide pensions as well. All that idea that there's just some kind of fear that we're never going to properly be able to pay pensions maybe within the present economic structure, the way that economies are constructed at present. But at the end of the day, governments create money out of nothing. They always have and they always will. And so the solution will rely around that fact, a fact that the banking class, the JP Morgan Chase class, don't really want you to identify, because that means they make their money through debt, through lending money at interest, basically. And so they don't want you to know the fact that we can all see that governments create money out of nothing if they want. And so the answers to the aging population will lie in a variety of ways, including government funding, including technology, of course, and including encouraging people in this country to have children, which can work to an extent, whether through tax breaks or working from home or esteeming motherhood, for example. All of these things can be fixed. You don't fix it simply by bringing in more and more immigrants. Let's read some comments before I go on. Hi to British Legends. Budgie Burger says, does John Swinney control the purse? Well, he absolutely does. And they all have to grovel for a slice. Yes, he was going on today in the speech about housing and how we need more housing. I'll get to that in a moment. But who should be in the audience and ask a question but Balfour Beatty, which is one of Britain, if not the world's biggest housing constructors. And the guy who asked the question, he goes, so I'm from a company that builds a lot of things in Scotland. We're called Balfour Beatty. And John Swinney goes, yes. As if, oh, Balfour Beatty's here. I didn't know Balfour Beatty would come along. Yes, I have heard of Balfour Beatty. I'm so clever. I do understand that they are actually they're a company, and I love companies. And Balfour Beatty, he's here. Yeah. Yeah, John. And Paul Hadlow says, we have several million British people of working age who are not in employment. Somebody actually stepped out of line today at that meeting and asked that question about how do we get people who are not in employment back into employment. And John Swinney just havered and how it was a complicated question, and how it has different strands in it, and how there's reasons why some people are unemployed and blah, blah, blah. In other words, shut up. You didn't listen to my speech, which was, we're going to get more immigrants into the country. And I guess that poor person is not going to be invited back again. But that was the only sensible question that sort of pushed at Swinney there. And yeah, he certainly wasn't able to tell us how about that. Now, let me just check something here before I go further. Excellent. Now, where am I? Yes. So, the crux of his issue was that growth is going to occur through two things. One, more immigration, and two, getting back into the European Union, right? I mean, or rather, from what I could discern, and he wasn't clear about this, simply joining the single market again, I think is what he was getting at. But he didn't properly explain that, but you could kind of divine, as it were, that he was talking about getting back into the single market, but he didn't really spell that out, although I think in an answer to one question he did raise that. So the immigration thing, and this is an example of how, as I mentioned last week, these people will raise the immigration matter, so that if we can get people into Holyrood. We can also be raising the immigration matter against his sort of thing. His idea was that he wants students who are in Scotland from abroad to be able to stay in Scotland after their student visa has expired. So their student visa will be for their period of study at a university or college. And he wants them to be able to stay in Scotland after their period of study has finished. And somehow this is going to increase growth in the economy. Now, again, not a single person in that audience said, well, wait a minute, don't you think that's prejudicing the Scottish graduates, the Indigenous Scottish graduates who have graduated? If there's now a whole flock of new, up to, well, how many, we don't know, foreign students, foreign graduates, all looking for the graduate jobs in Scotland, don't you think that's going to prejudice the chances of the Scots? Don't you think that's a betrayal of the Scottish students who have gone to university and college? Nobody thought to ask him that. Nobody thought to ask him that because, oh, what a complicated question. Nobody's ever thought of that one before. We'll just sit and listen to Swinney rotting off and not even say, oh, excuse me, Mr. Swinney, do you think that would work? Because what about, you know, my boy, my girl, they've come out, they're lawyers, they're engineers, they're scientists or whatever. Are you saying that they've got this whole new competition now that they've got to compete with for the jobs? Nobody thought to ask him that. Nobody thought to ask him that perhaps what might also be a problem is that this would encourage even more foreign students to apply for university and college in the knowledge that they would be able to stay on in Scotland. And don't you think that influx of more students might push out some of the Indigenous Scottish applications? Nobody thought to ask him that either. In fact, nobody thought to ask him anything except a whole load of tripe, except that one person who wondered why he wasn't concentrating on the presently unemployed in Scotland. Preston journalist, good to hear from you, my friend. Great show, he says. Would you rather have Starmer or Swinney running Scotland? There's a tough choice. Oh, you know what? I'm not even sure I want to answer that. Swinney, says Christopher, should have been challenged on dealing with reserved matters. Yes, that's not the way that politics works. The politicians will just say on any of these matters that they want to talk about. At least we know what Swinney wants. Now, what he wants are special visas, particularly for Scotland. Special visas, particularly for Scotland. So this would be a Scottish visa. So what it would mean is that your foreign student would have this visa that says you can find a job in Scotland, but it has to be in Scotland. You can't shift down to London or anything like that. And that's a possibility that they could, I mean, Starmer could bring in something like that. This famous headline from last year, Labour aims to work with SNP to encourage immigrants to live in Scotland. You know, that's from the Herald on Sunday of the 30th of June, 2024. Scottish Labour's deputy leader, Jackie Baillie, says new visa, once planned by Nicola Sturgeon, would address country's skills shortages. That's Labour saying that, okay? So we have to be conscious that maybe Swinney thinks he's pushing at an open door. Maybe he thinks he's pushing at an open door. Well, let me tell you, if Labour brought that in and allowed Swinney to exercise that work visa for Scotland, then I believe that would harm Labour's chances even further in 2026. It surely would. It surely would harm Labour if they did it. And I think maybe Labour understands that in an extent, because last week, in the National, January the 14th. Call for Scottish visa scheme dismissed by Home Office. Now, this was a different visa. This wasn't a student visa. This was a, what did they call it? A rural visa pilot proposal to ensure the needs of Scotland's employers, who are they? Communities, right? And public services are fully reflected within the immigration system, close quote. Before the general election, it says here, Scottish Labour leader Jackie Baillie told the Herald a new Labour government would be open to talks with ministers in Edinburgh about Scottish visa. Previously, a UK Labour government introduced a bespoke Scottish fresh talent scheme to allow university graduates to stay in the country for 2 years. Well, I do remember that fresh talent scheme, and we have got a long memory, and we have got detailed files here in the office. So I looked at our detailed files from back in 2004, which is to say 20 years ago, 20 and a half years ago, in the Sunday Herald, 13th of June, 2004. Fresh talent plan is doomed, within quotes. And this is 20 years ago, okay? Jack McConnell wanted to bring in, and did bring in, this fresh talent scheme. Didn't last for very long. Didn't get that many people. But remember, that's 20 years ago. We weren't facing the millions of people who are coming into Britain these days. Labour market experts claim there are insufficient jobs for native Scottish graduates, and that adding foreign graduates to the pool will only worsen their job prospects after 2005, when the scheme is introduced. Isn't that what I just said? Again, speaking 20 years ago, Professor Robert Wright, a Labour economist at Stirling University, said, quote, "Who are these thousands of students who have had a blissful 4 years here and want to stay? There are far more opportunities for them in London and the southeast of England. Graduates are leaving Scotland because there are too many for the jobs available. I just don't buy that the Scottish labour market can absorb any more graduates. In fact, we already actually have an over-education problem. We have no shortage of people with sociology degrees, but can you get a plumber? Everyone is crying out for lower-end skills," close quote. And that situation is the same today. 100 times so, it's the same today. Goodness me. All that John Swinney's going to do, if such a visa scheme came in, is prejudice the employment prospects of our own Scottish students here right now. It's so obvious. Christopher says, Labour are totally clueless, aren't they just? Britain's got talent, haven't we? Haven't we? Derek believes the reason why Swinney wants immigrants in Scotland is so that they will vote the SNP. Yes, because remember that the Tories unfortunately devolved the franchise to Holyrood, so Holyrood can make anybody vote that they want. And the Greens want you to be able to vote just on residence alone. In fact, that's the case already, isn't it? In Scotland. So yeah. Where are we? Yes, so back to Swinney's speech. Now, if you want to see Swinney's speech, it is actually at the let's bring it up here. And share screen. It's actually at the SNP website, so you can read the whole thing if you're inclined. First Minister John Swinney's speech on growing Scotland's economy. So it's all there. It's all there, or in fact, it's not all there, put it that way. And so he goes on talking about lots of things. And where are we? I'm trying to find. So he's going on here about Scotland's population is aging. And so the implication is we need more people. This is why we need a renewed focus on an immigration policy that works for Scotland, apparently. He says here, they're welcome for who they are, blah, 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 blah. But again, have no doubt. Like, he likes that phrase, have no doubt. Well, sorry, but I do doubt you. He goes, have no doubt they are essential for tax revenues, for the sustainability of public services like the NHS, and for the future success of our businesses, whether as paid employees or as paying customers. Well, we put out a tweet today just looking at that line, actually, the idea. And what we said here, there it is, the First Minister needs to explain. Well, yeah, that's one of the tweets that we put out. That's us talking about the foreign students. He needs to explain why he needs that. But the actual tweet that we put out, what did it say? I've got it here somewhere. And it was basically saying, yes, he's got no evidence. He's got no evidence that immigrants are paying in more taxes in Scotland than they are taken out in public services. He's got no evidence of that fact because he deliberately doesn't allow, Holyrood doesn't allow those details to be calculated. So we don't know if immigrants are paying in more taxes than they're taken out in the cost of public services. We don't know that. He doesn't know that because Holyrood deliberately doesn't let us know what these figures are. And that's another thing that, for example, Reform MSPs, if they were to be elected, they could do a deep dive on that. They could demand that those sorts of reports were made clear so that we knew what we were talking about. But basically in the areas where this sort of talk, where this sort of thing has been done, what you find is that immigration is generally a net negative economically. There's a Dutch study that was done. Let me just bring it up. Here we go. Dutch. Get away. What? Oh, that's not very good, is it? Let's get rid of that. Anyway, a Dutch study showed there that where it has been done, where the statistics have been looked into, mass immigration, especially of low-skilled to medium-skilled workers, is very much a net negative for the economy. That's in Holland where that's been done, but we can imagine that it's the same throughout the rest of Western Europe, generally speaking, because Scottish immigration doesn't really differ from anything else. And that's another thing that Swinney was talking about. He said that Scotland is somehow different from England, and so we need immigrants in a way that England doesn't. Complete nonsense, just complete rhetoric, just rhetoric with no substance. And that's what we're subjecting ourselves to these days, unfortunately, from our MSPs. So the main thing, the main message though was the foreign student notion, which no doubt we'll be hearing about more in the media over the next day or two, and hoping to rejoin the European single market. But as I say, the threat is real that Labour could bring in some kind of special visa for Scotland. But I don't know who they would be trying to placate if they did that. They wouldn't be servicing a demand. Like, there's not, people in Scotland are not wanting that. It's not like that's what we're all crying out for. So if they were to do something like that, they wouldn't be servicing any demand other than perhaps the demand of big employers who might want graduates who are going to work for less or something like that. Maybe that's why he made that speech to JP Morgan Chase today. Maybe it was something to do with that. Because as you say, Eric, back in the day, a degree actually meant something, not so much now. We do have a plethora of graduates. And as this chap said back 20 years ago, we have no shortage of people with sociology degrees, but can you get a plumber? Everyone is crying out for lower end skills these days. Scotland needs to be rid of the SNP next May. Well, we'll all do our best, James. I know you will. Catherine says apprenticeships in trades for our own is the way to go, in my opinion. Christopher says, I seem to remember a recent study putting the lifetime cost of each immigrant at around 40k to the UK. I'll need to dig it out. Yes, please do. Please do dig it out. In that article that we mentioned earlier, the one that's on our website, I think we link to that. Economy has nothing to show for mass immigration at aforceforgood.uk/blog. And we do link to one or two of these reports that attempted to do a calculation, much against in the data desert that unfortunately we are suffering from deliberately, because successive governments don't want us to know what the facts are. Let me see here. In fact, I can bring it up. Here we are. Economy has nothing to show for mass immigration. We run through here what is gross domestic product, the various measurements, very small impact of immigration on economic growth levels. From Professor Alan Manning of the London School of Economics. Well, if the London School of Economics are even saying that, that tells you that everybody's generally agreed. And down at the bottom here, gross domestic product, the consensus that mass migration makes us richer has been shattered. The consensus that mass migration makes us richer has been shattered. Top economic policy advisors' research challenges the left's long-standing certitude. Professor David Miles sits at the heart of the economic establishment, a member of the Office for Budget Responsibility Committee. He is used to forecasting the long-term impact of government policies. Yet in a paper for the Journal of the Economics of Aging, he last week challenged the consensus view that a country with a falling population is inevitably condemned to stagnation, indebtedness, and declining living standards. Well, that's what I was alluding to earlier in the day, wasn't it? The quality of life can certainly be higher with a smaller population, he wrote, arguing that while immigration can keep the ratio of young workers to pensioners stable, that calculation ignores the extra capital spending required to accommodate all those extra people. It calls into question the assumption that the world's richest nations will be far worse off with a shrinking population. Predictions of dire effects are implausible, he says. Yet for years, the economic establishment has insisted that while there may be concerns about the effects of mass immigration on our social fabric, no sensible person could argue against its economic benefits. There are many things that ail the British economy, but in the 20 years since we have adopted an increasingly open borders approach, the country has not become noticeably richer. That's for sure. And Japan, which runs very low levels of immigration, became the first major economy to experience population decline. Its economy has not experienced world-beating growth, but its expansion in 2022 was respectable. And of course, measuring the GDP per capita, that growth is even higher. In the UK, meanwhile, World Bank data suggests per capita GDP has fallen in real terms from 2007 to 2022. Yep, that's what it certainly feels like. That's what it certainly feels like. For the last 2 decades, there has been a suffocating consensus that mass immigration is always positive. The Conservatives bought into that, the Labour Party more so, and yet finally this is starting to break down. Perhaps we can finally have a serious discussion instead. Well, let's have a discussion, but let's actually do something about it. Let's actually do something about it. And one of the ways of doing something about it is to make sure that John Swinney and the SNP know that there are plenty of people in Scotland who don't agree with them. And in that regard, keep an eye out. That's all I'm saying for the time being. James says, youth unemployment is rising. If you bring in immigrants to do the work others here won't do, then one is defeating the purpose. Absolutely. Alan says, if they come and hoover up the money without working, we would be better off having a smaller population. That's right. That's right. Well, in the remaining 10 minutes, I just want to talk about the American election, which the American inauguration, I should say, which was on Monday the 20th. It's very interesting to watch. I don't know if any of you watched the whole thing. I watched the whole thing being streamed live. And yeah, very, very interesting. I thought Melania stole the show, almost an otherworldly presence with that hat and coat on. She definitely gave us all something to remember. That's for sure. Anyway, I noticed in the Herald on Sunday, this Sunday on the 19th, they had a very interesting cover, which certainly did the trick for me because I bought the newspaper. I especially wanted to see this bit here. Academics on possibility of president annexing Scotland. So yeah, clickbait, definitely. But yeah, I did shell out £2.80 to read that article, which I'll talk to you right now about. Could Trump possibly be eyeing up Scotland for annexation? A ridiculous fantasy or next on his shopping list. Today, several senior political academics talked to the Herald on Sunday on the unpredictable president's global ambitions. And of course, a lot of this has been inspired, as it were, by the Greenland situation and the Panama Canal situation, which nobody really knows what Trump is getting up to on any of these things, or what his intentions may be. Somebody here, one of the academics, Professor Carman at the University of Glasgow, said, on Greenland, I think it is unclear whether Trump really wants the US to buy Greenland for the US, or whether this is a tactic to push for more favorable military and industrial access to Greenland's strategic location and resources. I think that's a good way of putting it, actually. Again, we're back to the do we take Trump seriously or literally issue. I have seen some reporting that Denmark has already sent back some back channel messages to Trump that while Greenland is not for sale, Denmark might be willing to negotiate more favorable access for US interests to Greenland. We might imagine that Trump is hoping for similar communications from Panama in relation to the canal. Indeed. I like this bit from George Allison, editor of the UK Defence Journal. He said Scotland plays a critical defence role and dismissed the prospective idea of Mr. Trump wanting to buy the country as absurd. But quite a good summary here, which I'll just read out in full from George Allison. Quote, Scotland's geography places it at the centre of NATO's defence priorities in the North Atlantic, safeguarding vital transatlantic routes. The UK's submarines at Faslane and the maritime patrol aircraft at Lossiemouth directly contribute to NATO's deterrence and defence posture, particularly given increased Russian submarine activity in the GI-UK gap. I guess that's Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. As for the idea of Trump, quote-unquote, buying Scotland, it is indeed absurd. Scotland's integration into the UK and its devolved governments make such a scenario legally and politically inconceivable. Unlike Greenland, which exists within a colonial framework under Denmark, Scotland has a long-standing national identity and political institutions that would render any notion of acquisition laughable. Furthermore, Scotland's indispensable role in NATO's northern defence architecture makes it a critical ally, not a commodity. So a good wee summary there of Scotland's strategic importance to NATO, at least, and indeed to the United Kingdom. James says Trump will probably want to buy Denmark as well. Budgie Burkers are not convinced that Trump's going to be anything other than a globalist. Time will tell. Time will tell. I hope that he is an America firster. You can always tell if they're an America firster by their attitude to foreign countries, and whether they put foreign countries on a par with America or worse, above America. And that's going to become clearer as the year goes on and the Middle East conflict whether it gets worse or whether it gets better. And so we can always tell. It's always interesting to look back. The Americans have this concept of the founding fathers, and they'll always quote George Washington on something, or something that Abraham Lincoln said, or Alexander Hamilton, or Benjamin Franklin, or stuff like that. And we here in the United Kingdom don't have so much of that at all. We don't have a sort of founding fathers attitude to things. We don't quote, generally speaking, any of the past prime ministers or kings or queens in a kind of nationalistic sense. I think we should, actually. I think we should. And we at A Force for Good tend to do so. We've always quoted James VI, who we do see as a genuine founding father of the United Kingdom, the man, the Scots king who became the first king of Great Britain. He had a lot to say about Britain, and a lot of his stuff we've tried to bring out. Doing a bit of research on attitudes to foreign countries, and we found a really good quote from a previous prime minister called Henry Temple. And I wonder if I've got it to hand. Yes, I do. Let's stick up the picture of Henry Temple. That's him. Now, he was also called Lord Palmerston, and he was the British Prime Minister between 1855 to 1858, and again for another 6 years between 1859 and 1865. And he was also Foreign Secretary. And when he was Foreign Secretary in the House of Commons, now bear in mind, this is at the time of Britain's widest power in the world, at the height of the empire. When he was Foreign Secretary on the 1st of March, 1848, he said about Britain and its relations with other countries, he said, quote, "We have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." Okay. So I'm going to read that again. That was a good quote. And what he's basically saying is that we don't take sides. We look at the world out there and we say, how does this benefit Britain? You're not our ally. You're not our enemy either. But we do have interests, perpetual interests, eternal interests, and we follow those interests. He said, we have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow. And that's from the man who steered Britain at the height of its empire, who steered Britain as Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. He said that, and quite frankly, that's good enough for me. That's good enough for me, and that's good enough for A Force for Good's foreign policy. We're going to quote the founding father, Lord Palmerston, aka Henry Temple, a man that we hitherto know very little about in the office here. Folks, it's the top of the hour. Eric says, I think the SNP should read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. In fact, our government should read it instead of Engels and Marx. Good point. Christopher says, here's the true cost of immigrants to the UK, and has put up a link in the Facebook comment thread. Thank you for that. Great stuff. Well, folks, we are going to be back next Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. It just remains for me to say thank you for your comments. Thanks for checking in on us. Please do give us a repost if you're watching on X. It really helps to get the message out. Give us a share if you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube. Certainly, please do give us a like and a thumbs up. And that will really help us. Until next week, it just remains for me to say, God bless the United Kingdom and God save the King. See you next week.